Greetings, everyone. This is Ali Hassan from Alhamid Consulting. This is presentation number 11 in our series of presentations on project management for all. Today we are going to talk about the project scope management. As we know, the main constraints to be managed in every project are scope, cost, schedule, and quality. And this presentation on scope management. There is a lot of information actually and things to be considered in this scope management. I'm not going to go into detail into all of this because each part of this or process requires a separate presentation. So let us focus now on the main items and activities of the scope management. And first, we're going to talk about the definition and the overview of the scope management. So this definition is taken from the PM book, the project management book of knowledge of management knowledge. So the PM book defines project scope management as all the processes required to ensure that the project includes all the work required and only the work required to complete the project successfully. Managing the project scope is primarily concerned with defining and controlling what is and what is not included in the project. The project scope management processes are six processes. The plan scope management, collect requirements, define scope, create WBS, i.e. the work breakdown structure, and validate scope, and the last one is control scope. And we are going to go into detail on each one of these processes. This diagram gives an overview of these processes and the input tools and outputs of each one of them. But before that, let us talk about some main concepts. So there are some key concepts in this regard. When we talk about the scope, the term scope, it may mean two different things. The product scope is all the features and functions that characterize a product, service, or results. So the features and functions. While the project scope is the work itself performed to deliver a product, service, or result with the specified features and functions. So the term project scope is sometimes viewed as to include the product scope. There are two types of project actually. The adaptive life cycle type and the predictive project. The adaptive projects, so projects with adaptive life cycles are intended to respond to high level of change and require ongoing stakeholders engagement. This doesn't mean that the predictive ones do not need stakeholders engagement, but the adaptive one need ongoing stakeholders stakeholders engagement. The overall scope of an adaptive project will be decomposed into a set of requirements and work to be performed, sometimes referred to as product backlog. At the beginning of each iteration, because there are many iterations in the adaptive project scope, project adaptive projects. So in the beginning of each iteration, the team will work to determine how many of the highest priority items, on the backlog list can be delivered within the next iteration. And each iteration should be done in, say, 2 to 8 weeks. It shouldn't be more than 8 weeks. So 3 processes: the collect requirements, define scope, and create WBS are repeated for each iteration. On the contrary, the predictive projects, these processes are performed toward the beginning of the project and updated as necessary using the integrated change control process. So the completion of the project scope is measured against the project management plan, while completion of the product scope is measured against the product requirements. This is one of the differences between the product and the product scope and project scope. The term requirement is defined as a condition or capability that is required to be present in a product, service, or result to satisfy an agreement or other formally imposed specification. Now we talk about some trends and emerging practices in project scope management. Requirements have always been a concern in project management and have continued to gain more attention in the profession. As the global environment becomes more complex, organizations are starting to recognize how to use the business analysis to their competitive advantage by defining, managing, and controlling requirements activities. Activities of business analysis may start before a project is initiated and a project manager is assigned. So the business analyst is required before the project initiation and before the project manager is assigned. The requirements management process starts with a needs assessment, which may begin in portfolio planning and program planning or within a discrete project. The role with responsibility to conduct business analysis should be assigned to resources with sufficient business analysis skills and expertise. If a business analyst is assigned to a project, requirement-related activities are the responsibilities of that role. The project manager is responsible for ensuring that requirements-related work is accounted for in the project management plan and that requirements-related activities are performed on time and within budget and deliver value. The relationship between the project manager and the business analyst should be a collaborative partnership. A project will have a higher likelihood of being successful if project manager and business analyst fully understand each other's roles and responsibilities to successfully achieve project objectives. to tailoring considerations. So because each project is unique, the project manager will need to tailor the way project scope management processes are applied. Considerations for tailoring include many things, include knowledge and requirement management, validation and control, development approach, stability of requirements, and governance. Governance, does the organization have a formal or informal audit and governance policies, procedures, and guidelines? I just want to touch on shortly on the considerations for agile and adaptive environments. In projects with evolving requirements, high risk, or significant uncertainty, the scope is often not understood at the beginning of the project, or it evolves during the project. So agile methods deliberately spend less time trying to define and agree on scope in the early stages of the project, and actually spend more time establishing the process for its ongoing discovery and refinement. And now we talk about each of these processes. So the plan scope management, that's the first process. Definition, the process of creating a scope management plan that documents how the project and product scope will be defined, validated, and controlled. The key benefit of this process, it provides guidance and direction on how scope will be managed throughout the project. This process is performed once or at predefined points in the project. The scope management plan is a component of the project or program management plan, and which describes how the scope will be defined, developed, monitored, controlled, and validated. The development of the scope management plan and the detailing of the project scope begins with the analysis of information contained in the project charter. This is the process data flow, and it is reproduced from the PM book actually. So we could see how the developed charter give us the project charter, PM project management plan. We use the quality management plan, life cycle description, development approach, and so on. Now we go into details of the inputs and tools and techniques and outputs of the plan scope management. So the inputs to the plan scope management, the first thing is the project charter, and we talked about this before actually. The project charter documents the project purpose, high-level project description, and assumptions, constraints, and high-level requirements that the project is intended to satisfy. The second input to this process is the project management plan. So in this one, we use the quality management plan. We use the project life cycle description, which is the project life cycle determines the series of phases that a project passes through from its inception to the end of the project. And also the development approach. The development approach defines whether waterfall, iterative, adaptive, agile, or hybrid development approach will be used. The third input to this process is the enterprise environmental factors, which are the organization culture, infrastructure, personal administration, and marketplace conditions. Also, the input to this process is the organizational process assets, which are the policies and procedures of this organization, and also historical information and lesson learned database. So what are the tools and techniques which are used in this process? So the first one is the expert judgment. Expertise should be considered from individuals or groups with specialized knowledge or training in the following topics: previous similar projects and information in the industry, discipline, and application area. The second tool and technique is the data analysis. So what do we mean by data analysis? Data analysis technique that can be used for this process includes, but is not limited to, alternative analysis, which means various ways of collecting requirements, elaborating the project and product scope, creating the product, validating the scope, and controlling the scope are evaluated, how they are evaluated. The third tool and technique is the meetings. So project teams may attend project meetings to develop the scope management plan. Attendees may include the project manager, the project sponsor, selected project team members, selected stakeholders, anyone with responsibility for any of the scope management processes, and others as needed. So what are the outputs of this process? So the outputs of the plan scope management, the first one is the scope management plan. The scope management plan is a component, as we said, of the project management plan that describes how the scope will be defined, developed, monitored, controlled, and validated. The components of the scope management plan include process for preparing a project scope statement, process that enables the creation of the work breakdown structure from the detailed project scope statement, process that establishes how the scope baseline will be approved and maintained, and the process that specifies how the formal acceptance of the completed project deliverables will be obtained. The scope management plan can be formal or informal, broadly framed or highly detailed, based on the needs of each project. Some projects are smaller projects, so we don't need to spend so much money to develop the project scope management plan. The second output of the plan scope management is the requirements management plan. The requirements management plan is a component of the project management plan that describes how the project and product requirements will be analyzed, documented, and managed. Some organizations refer to it as a business analysis plan. The components of the requirements management plan include how requirements activities will be planned, tracked, and reported, configuration management activities, requirements prioritization process, and metrics that will be used and rationale for using them, and traceability structure that reflects the requirement attributes captured on the traceability matrix. So this is the end of this first part of the project scope management plan. The second process, the collect requirements. So collect requirements, the definition is the process of determining, documenting, and managing the stakeholders' needs and requirements to meet objectives. The key benefits of it is it provides the basis for defining the product scope and project scope. This process is performed once or at predefined points in the project. Stakeholders' involvement. The discovery and decomposition of the needs to project and product requirements, determining, documenting and managing the requirements of the product, service or result of the project. So we need the stakeholders' involvement in all these activities. The requirements include conditions or capabilities that are required to be present in a product, service or result to satisfy an agreement or other formally imposed specification. Requirements become the foundation of the work program structure. Cost, schedule, quality planning, and procurement are all based on these requirements. So this is the data flow diagram of the collect requirements process. The inputs and tools and outputs of the process. So the inputs are the project charter, and we talked about this before, the project management plan, the project documents, which are the assumption log, lesson learned, register, stakeholder register, business documents, which are the business case, agreements and contracts, enterprise environmental factors, and organizational process assets. And we talked about these actually in the first section of this presentation. The tools used in this process are the expert judgment, and we talked about this, data gathering. Data gathering actually could be done by brainstorming, interviews, focus groups, questionnaires and surveys, benchmarking, and data analysis, which include document analysis. And fourth tool is decision making. Decision making, actually, there are three types of decision making. So it could be by voting, autocratic decision making, multi-criteria decision analysis. The fifth tool is the data representation. The sixth one is the interpersonal and team skills. The seventh one is the context diagram and prototypes. And I'm not going to go into detail on each one of this because it will take a lot of time. So I will refer you to the PM book and other database and things to have more information on these. The output of this collect requirements process is the requirements documentation and the requirements traceability matrix. And we can talk a little bit about these outputs. So there's a lot of information actually on this, and I'm not going to go into detail. So the outputs, as we said, is the requirement documentation. Requirement documentation describes how individual requirements meet the business need for the project. Requirements may start out at a high level and become progressively more detailed as more information about the requirement is known. The second output is the requirements traceability matrix. The traceability matrix is a grid that links product requirements from their origin to the deliverables that satisfy the system. The implementation of requirements traceability matrix helps ensure that each requirement adds business value by linking it to the business and project objectives. Now we talk about the third process, which is the define scope. So define scope, the definition is it is the process of developing a detailed description of project and product. The key benefit of this process is it describes the product, service, or result boundaries and acceptance criteria. And this is the data flow of this process. So the main inputs to this process are the project charter, and we came across this before. And the second one is the project management plan, and part of it is the scope management plan. And the third input is the project documents, which are the assumption log, requirements documentation, risk register. The fourth input is the enterprise environmental factors, and the fifth one is the organizational process assets, and we talked about this also before. Tools and techniques, expert judgment, data analysis, decision making, interpersonal and team skills, and product analysis. The outputs of this process is the project scope statement and the project documents updates, and we will talk a little bit about these in a minute. So the project scope statement is the description of the project scope, major deliverables, and exclusions. The project scope statement documents the entire scope, including product and product scope. It describes the project deliverables in detail. It also provides a common understanding of the project scope among project stakeholders. It may contain explicit scope exclusions that can assist in managing stakeholders' expectations. It enables the project team to perform more detailed planning, guides the project team work during execution, and provide the baseline for evaluating whether requests for changes or additional work are contained within or outside the project boundaries. The degree and level of detail to which the project scope statement defines the work will be performed, and work that is excluded can help determine how well the project management team can control the overall project scope. The second output of this process is the project documents update. So we need to update the assumption log. We may need to update the requirements documentation. We may need to update the requirements traceability matrix. And also we may need to update the stakeholder register. The fourth process is the create work breakdown structure, which is the WBS. The definition of this process, so the create WBS is the process of subdividing project deliverables and project work into smaller, more manageable components. So, the scope of the project may contain major milestones. So in order to control these, major activities, we subdivide them into smaller activities in order to be easily managed. The key benefit of this process is that it provides a framework of what has to be delivered. This process is performed once or at predefined points in the project. This diagram shows the data flow of this process. So the inputs to this process are the project management plan, and part of it is the scope management plan. Second is the project documents, project scope statement, requirement documentation, and the third one is the enterprise environmental factors, and the fourth one is the organizational process assets, and we talked about this before. The tools and techniques are the expert judgment and the composition, and also we talked about both of these tools and techniques before. The outputs of this process is the scope baseline. The first one is the scope baseline, and the second one is the scope documents update. So let us talk a little bit about these outputs in a minute. So as we said, the outputs of the create WBS process is the scope baseline. The first one is scope baseline, which means the baseline means the approved version of a scope statement, WBS, and its associated WBS dictionary, which can be changed only through a formal change control procedure and is used as a basis for comparison. So you cannot change the baseline unless there is a formal process and there is approval to this change. It is a component of the project management plan, and the components of the scope baseline include project scope statement, WBS, and which means work package, planning package. The WBS dictionary, it contains the code of account identifier, description of work, assumptions and constraints, responsibility organization, schedule milestones, associated schedule activities, resources required, cost estimates, quality requirements, acceptance criteria, technical references, and agreement information. The project documents update, we may need to update the assumption log and requirements documentation. The fifth process is the validate scope. The definition of this process is that the process of formalizing it means the process of formalizing acceptance of the completed project deliverables. The key benefit of this process, it brings objectivity to the acceptance process and increases the probability of final product, service, or result acceptance by validating each deliverable. This process is performed periodically throughout the project as needed. And this diagram shows the data flow, which is reproduced from the PM book. The inputs to this process are the project management plan and the project documents, which are the lesson learned register, quality reports, requirement documentation, requirement traceability matrix, and the third one is the verified deliverables and work performance data. The tools and techniques used for this process are inspection and decision making. The outputs of this process are the accepted deliverables. The second one is work performance information. Third one is change request. And the fourth is project documents update. So I'm going to take about some of these outputs. The accepted deliverables are that meet the acceptance criteria are formally signed off and approved by the customer or sponsor. So make sure that your sponsor and customer sign off on these accepted deliverables and keep this into your documentation database. So the formal documentation received from the customer or sponsor acknowledging the formal stakeholders' acceptance of the project deliverables is forwarded to the close project or phase process. And we talked about this phase before, the close project. The second output is the work performance information. Includes the information about project progress, such as which deliverables have been accepted and which have not been accepted, and the reasons why they have not been accepted. The information is documented and communicated to the stakeholders. The third output is the change request. This is very important. The completed deliverables that have not been formally accepted are documented, along with the reasons for non-acceptance of those deliverables. So those deliverables may require a change request for defect repair, and the change requests are processed for review and disposition through the Perform integrated change control process. And the repair or defect repair doesn't mean that you need to pay the contractor. If it's his fault, he has to pay for it, but it has to be documented. And the project documents to be updated as the lesson learned register, requirements documentation, and requirements traceability matrix. The last process in this scope management process is the control scope definition. So the definition of this process, the control scope is the process of monitoring the status of the project and the product scope and managing changes to the scope baseline. The key benefit of this process is that the scope baseline is maintained throughout the project. This process is performed throughout the project. So you need this process the whole time and during the project. And this diagram shows the data flow of this process. The inputs to this process are the project management plan, the scope management plan, requirement management plan, change management plan, configuration management plan, scope baseline, performance measurement baseline. The second one is the project documents, and they are the lesson learned register, requirements documentation, requirements traceability matrix. And the third input is the work performance data. And the fourth one is the organizational process assets. Tools and techniques used are the data analysis, variance analysis, and trend analysis. And I will talk about these a little bit later on. The output is the work performance information, change request, project management plan updates, project documents updates, and requirements traceability matrix. So what do we mean by the tools and techniques used here? So variance analysis, the data analysis techniques that can be used include the variance analysis and trend analysis. Well, what do we mean by variance analysis? Variance analysis is used to compare the baseline to the actual results and determine is the variance within the threshold amount or if corrective or preventive action is required. So, if it is within the threshold foreseen, there is no need for corrective or preventive action. If it is not, there should be a corrective or preventive action to be done. The trend analysis examines the project performance over time to determine if performance is improving or deteriorating. The important aspects of project scope control include determining the cause and degree of variance relative to the scope baseline and deciding whether corrective or preventive action is required. And the outputs, as we said, the outputs of this process are the work performance information and the change request. The change request analysis of project performance may result in change request to the scope and components of the project management plan. Change requests are processed for review and disposition through the performance integration change control process. And the last output of this process is, the third process, the project management plan updates. So we may need to update the process scope management plan. We may need to update the scope baseline. We may need to update the schedule baseline. We may also need to update the cost baseline and also the performance measurement baseline. The fourth output is the project documents updates. So we may need to update the lesson learned register and the requirements documentation and the requirements traceability matrix. The requirements traceability matrix may be updated to reflect updated in requirement documentation. So this is the last section of this process, the scope management plan, and I hope it is helpful. I know it's a lot of information, and I refer you to the literature on this subject because it's a very important subject, and hope to see you in the next presentation. Thank you very much and see you again.